Hello Star Wars fans, and welcome to episode 87 of Journey into Legends. Today we'll be reading Star by Star by Troy Denning. Star by Star was released in 2001, and it is the 9th book in the New Jedi Order series. I'm so extremely excited to finally read this book. This was one of the books that I was most excited to get to in this series, so without further ado, let's read and review. Alright, so before we get to the full novel, I just finished reading the ebook Recovery by Troy Denning, which takes place soon after Balance Point. However, since I heard it spoiled a bit of the Edge of Victory duology, I decided to save it until now, which works since it was included in the paperback version of Star by Star. Anyways, I really enjoyed Recovery. I was expecting a lot more of the story to focus on Han and Leia fixing their marriage. I'm surprised at how minor of a plot point that was, and I would have liked to have seen more of that, but I am happy with what we got. Other than that, we also met a new group of Jedi called the Wild Knights, including Elisa, Izal Waz, and my personal favorite, Tisar Sabatine. I really enjoyed these characters, specifically the Barabels, who I thought were hilarious. And finally, a major plot point in this story involves Vicky Shesh's attempts to actually assassinate Leia, culminating in Leia publicly exposing Vicky and preventing an anti-Jedi bill from being passed. This was probably the weakest aspect of the story, since I thought it took away from the very strong character work going on. But overall, again, I still enjoyed this story. Anyways, let's jump into Star by Star. So let's start by getting some of the more minor subplots out of the way. Let's start with the continuation of the refugee plotline, as well as Savong Law's ultimatum. The Yuuzhan Vong continue to leverage the lives of refugees, this time from Talfaglio, in return for captured Jedi. And overall, this plotline was pretty much more of what we've been seeing since the Agents of Chaos duology and Balance Point. However, there were a few really fun moments, specifically anything with Nom Anor. On multiple occasions, Nom Anor actually meets with representatives of the New Republic to discuss terms, even speaking before the Senate at one point, and it's really interesting to see Nom Anor, so conniving and tricky as he is, be put in a position such as this. There was also the battle at Talfaglio where the Jedi completely humiliated the Vong, which was really cool to see. Another pretty minor subplot involves Vicky Shesh continuing to be completely deplorable, more so than usual. Not only does she attempt an assassination of the Chief of State Borsk Phalia, but after being humiliated by Luke in the Senate, she actually spends the rest of the book attempting to kidnap the infant Ben Skywalker multiple times. It's actually really surprising that they managed to make a character more deplorable and unlikable than Borsk Phalia, who, by the way, actually acted pretty cool throughout this book. So starting with the major storylines now, the book begins by introducing a new threat called the Voxyn, who are basically these reptilian beasts bred by the Yuuzhan Vong to hunt Jedi. And this was a really great and honestly a really terrifying sequence to start this book, with some great tension as the Voxyn hunts down the Jedi sisters Alima and Numa Rar on a refugee ship, and had some really grotesque body horror as well. And overall, this opening chapter did a great job of kicking off the book and introducing the Voxyn and just setting the tone for the rest of the book. Later on, there are a few mentions here and there of various Jedi being hunted and killed by the Voxyn, including Lusa from Crystal Star and Lyric from Junior Jedi Knights. And I've seen some controversy surrounding Troy Denning just nonchalantly killing characters off screen just to add some tension. but I thought this was pretty well handled. I think it did a good job of raising the stakes, and I think the characters killed off were well chosen, since they all had emotional connections to some of our main characters, but they were minor enough characters that killing them off screen doesn't really do the reader or the characters a disservice. Although it would have been nice to get a short story or comic later on that explored some of these character deaths. Anyways, other than that opening chapter, I think the Voxyn were much less threatening than they could have been. It's a shame that they were only ever really utilized in the Myrkr plotline. I think there could have been some really thrilling scenes of a Voxyn hunting 3PO as he tries to protect baby Ben Skywalker or something like that. Moving on to arguably the biggest storyline in this book, we of course have the Myrkr strike team, who infiltrate the world ship above Myrkr to kill the Voxyn Queen. And overall, although I was really looking forward to this plotline, I actually ended up pretty disappointed with it in the long run. Firstly, I found the world ship very hard to visualize. I honestly wish that the plotline had taken place on the planet of Myrkr. I think the forest would have been a much more interesting setting, and would have allowed for more thrilling fight scenes and more quiet scenes as well. One of my main issues, and not just in this plotline but for the whole book, was that the action was extremely hard to follow. Whether it was a dogfight, a fight scene, or a battle, I don't think there was a single action scene in this book that I was able to follow. I just think Troy Denning is not very good at painting a vivid picture, and his action is all over the place and very chaotic. And the problem with the Myrkr plotline is that there was so much action and not nearly enough character interactions. Specifically, I don't know why there was basically no scenes between Anakin and Tahiri after all the build-up from the Edge of Victory duology. I think that, as well as more scenes between Anakin and his siblings, would have made his death a lot more emotional. But overall, this mission was still entertaining. It's always fun to see so many Jedi go on a mission together, and all the Jedi deaths, as well as Jason's capture and Raynar's disappearance, really helped to raise the stakes. And of course, we've got to talk about the elephant in the room, easily the biggest and most impactful death in the series, probably the entire EU, the death of Anakin Solo. Now, I know a lot of people hated the decision to kill off Anakin, just as a lot of people hated the decision to kill off Chewie. Do I think it was the right decision? Not necessarily. I think that he definitely had a potential for so much more, and I can't say definitively that killing him off was the best possible choice. But I personally don't have any problems with it. I think it accomplished what it set out to do. It was extremely emotional, an absolute gut punch. It was honestly surreal. I've known about Anakin's death for quite a while, and even then I still found it really hard to believe that he was gone, which made his death that much sadder. It was also really sad when Jaina went back to retrieve her brother's body. Now, the scene itself was really sad, but what I found even sadder was the reactions to his death, specifically his parents, with Leia completely breaking down and Han shooting everything in sight, as well as Luke's. Unfortunately, nobody had any time to truly grieve Anakin's death, as the Yuuzhan Vong finally reached Coruscant. And of course, other than Anakin's death and the Myrkr plotline as a whole, the other big climactic moment in this book involves the Vong finally reaching Coruscant and taking the planet. Once again, I enjoyed this battle, but I found it pretty underwhelming. Specifically the scale. It was said to be a huge battle, but we're never shown that. Mainly because we only ever follow the perspective of our main characters, as well as a really poorly timed kidnapping attempt by Vicky Shesh. I think that did nothing but distract from the story. I think a lot of that could have been trimmed, and we could have seen more perspectives to this battle, including citizens of the planet and other local fleets coming to help to really show how desperate things have become for the galaxy. But anyways, this was still a pretty fun battle with some great moments. Chief among them, no pun intended, was Chief of State Borsk Phalia's sacrifice, which claimed the lives of about 25,000 Vong warriors. A really great scene, but again, we didn't get to see nearly as much of it as I'd hoped, with more focus being put on more hard-to-follow action scenes. So overall, this book's plot was extremely epic and grand in scale, emotional, and super dark and grim. I think the story being told here with the Voxyn, Anakin's death, the Fall of Coruscant, I think all of it really works. However, I thought the execution was very lackluster. Like I said, I think there was way too much action, all of it very poorly written and hard to follow. And I think the book was just too long. Honestly, I think this book would have worked better as a duology of two separate books, with the first book maybe ending with the triumphant victory at Talfaglio, as well as the first death of the strike team Ula Hakor. Because as it stands, the book is over 600 pages, which it really doesn't need to be, and because of that, there's a lot of little details that I never even mentioned in this review, such as Vergir, the Yamosk plotline with Dany and Silgal, the two Dark Jedi stealing the shuttle with Raynar Thul and disappearing. This was a very eventful book, but in the end, I think it spent way too much time on the wrong scenes and moments, and neglected a lot of others, perhaps just like this review. But overall, I still enjoyed this book quite a bit. It just ended up being a bit disappointing, since it wasn't my absolute favorite of the series, and if done right, I really think it should have been. Alright, next we have Star Wars Tales issue number 12, which has 5 stories, starting with A Day in the Life, which follows Wedge Antilles shortly after the Battle of Endor. We get a look into what life is like for Wedge, including a battle, his thoughts after, his feelings on losing a fellow pilot, as well as a conversation with Luke about what comes next. Overall, this story wasn't bad, it just provides nothing we haven't already seen much better in the novels. There were also a few continuity errors, specifically that this story takes place at the same time as when the Truce at Bakura is supposed to have taken place. It also features the fairly intact wreckage of the Executor, which is completely unbelievable since it clearly blew up twice in Return of the Jedi. Anyways, next we have A Jedi's Weapon, in which Anakin and Obi-Wan negotiate with representatives from Kashyyyr about the planet joining the Republic. During the mission, Anakin's lightsaber is stolen, but when he goes to retrieve it, he finds that the lightsaber has been stolen by yet another person. When he goes to tell Obi-Wan that he lost his saber, it turns out that Obi-Wan was the one that stole it. Overall, this one was a decent story overall, albeit a little bit forgettable. Our next story is The Revenge of Tag and Bink, which of course follows Tag and Bink, as they get thrown into the Sarlacc after getting hunted down by Boba Fett. This is actually my first introduction to the characters of Tag and Bink, so I don't have any prior knowledge of them, and overall, I actually didn't mind this story. I usually really dislike these comedic stories, but this one wasn't too bad. However, it still is non-canon. The next story is Once Bitten, which takes place during A New Hope, as Obi-Wan tells Han a story about a mission he went on with Qui-Gon, where they ended up dueling Aurra Sing. Overall, I went into this really excited to get a story about Obi-Wan and Han during Episode 4, but this just felt a little too forced. Obi-Wan tells Han the story for no real reason, and it just felt like a cheap, pretty non-creative way to connect old Ben to the younger Padawan Obi-Wan from the prequels. Anyways, our last story is The Duty, which follows a Jedi named Ghira as he protects a group of Padawans from Darth Vader. But as he and Vader duel, Vader promises to let the Padawans live if Ghira agrees to join him. Though Ghira ends up joining Vader, the Padawans are still killed, and the story ends with Ghira killing himself. Overall, I always like seeing more stories about Vader hunting Jedi, but this one just felt a little off. Vader acted very out of character, the art was really bad, and the ending was just pretty out of nowhere. Overall, this was a pretty disappointing issue. There were no truly horrible stories, but none that stood out as particularly memorable. Anyways, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and stay tuned for my next review, where I'll be reading Dark Journey and a bunch of short stories by Elaine Cunningham. See ya!